All right, well, it's about 7 o'clock, so I guess we are going to get going. And we've done some work, and hopefully those of you joining us on the YouTube stream can hear us better this week, and we fixed some of those problems from last week, and hopefully this goes a little bit smoother. But again, for those of you who were not joining us, we are continuing on our 5-part series called Unearthing the Bible, where we're sort of looking at the archaeological and cultural context of the Hebrew Bible as a way of helping us understand these stories in a new, different, or perhaps better way. And so this week we are talking about Noah. In 2 weeks, we'll be back for Abraham, moving on to Moses and Joshua mid-November, and then David in December. Recap for those of you who may not have been here last week or need, I guess 2 weeks ago, but need a little bit of a reminder. Last time we were introducing this idea that the Hebrew Bible takes place in a geographic and chronological setting. That chronological setting is basically the Bronze and Iron Age. The geographical setting is largely the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel, Palestine, parts of Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. So that we have a setting. And that, in general, the broad background, the broad setting for these stories in our Hebrew Bible matches the broad story that we know from other sources. And so last week we reviewed a number of the other sources we have and said that not necessarily the specifics, but the broad outline of history generally matches. And we argued that understanding Bronze and Iron Age, right, ancient Near Eastern cultures helps us better understand the cultural context of the biblical stories. And it's this part that we want to continue today as we get into our specifics of Noah. So here again, we want to start out with our idea of introducing the chronological setting. And immediately I'm going to have a bit of a problem for you because the chronological setting for Noah is really sort of a mythic past. The story of Noah, our flood story, really takes place, even in our biblical terms, a long, long time ago or once upon a time, right? So our setting is not so much in this world of the Bronze and Iron Age. It's very much in a remembered world, right? A remembered history or tradition that's not quite placed specifically in a time period. But we do have a literary and cultural setting, and that's generally going to be this time period here, our second millennium into early first millennium BC. So let's say around 1800 to 700, 650 in southern Mesopotamia. So we have a different geographic setting, right? Our geographic setting is no longer over here in Israel, Canaan. Our setting is here, modern day southern Iraq. And so what we know about flood traditions, these flood stories, they seem to be taking place in ancient Sumer, ancient Babylon, right? Babylon down here, cities of Sumer down here towards the Persian Gulf, in the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Geographically, this makes sense for a flood story. Our early civilizations lived by rivers. They live between rivers, and rivers flood, right? So this is a type of disaster we'd be familiar with. In modern day Israel, we don't have floods as a very common occurrence, right? Our geography is different. Certain areas do flood, right? But our mass flooding is not as much of a danger as these flat plains between the rivers with these cities. And flooding is a known phenomenon, a known problem in this part of the world. And in fact, the part of the world that we seem to be setting, right? If we are going to ask the question, when does the Hebrew Bible transition to be talking about this area? That's going to be with the call of Abraham, right? Where is Abraham? We'll get to this in 2 weeks, but Abraham's story starts out in Babylon, in Ur, and it's going to travel up to Haran and then down eventually into Canaan. So our setting is still from our biblical context. We haven't come to Canaan yet, so the Mesopotamian setting also makes sense in that broad general framework. So chronologically, mythic past, but textually second millennium, geographically southern Mesopotamia. Again, hearkening back to what we were talking about 2 weeks ago, our interest in this, we can really trace back to early excavations in Mesopotamia. We talked 2 weeks ago about the excavations at Nineveh by Sir Austin Henry Layard and the finds of the Library of Ashurbanipal. Library of Ashurbanipal is one of our major collections of texts dating to the 7th century BC, so that's sort of our late Iron Age. And we noticed that among these texts, one of the scholars working at the British Museum, George Smith, discovered a story about a great flood. Discovered a story about a hero who, with the help of the gods, survives this great flood. And we talked about the discovery of this tablet, which is actually tablet 11 from the Epic of Gilgamesh, as spurring a lot of interest in what the ancient Near East could tell us about the world of the Bible and understanding it. And these are the texts we want to get into a little bit more today. And because what we find is that this tablet here, this is our tablet 11, that describes our flood account, is not the only flood narrative we have from the ancient world, from the ancient Near East. In fact, we have 5 main traditions and a couple other smaller ones that we're not going to get into. Right? We have a flood story from the Sumerian tradition, or at least in the Sumerian language. We have the story of Atra-Hasis, a wise hero of the distant past. We have the story from the Gilgamesh epic. We have the tale that we're probably more familiar with of Noah from the Hebrew Bible. And we have an account from a later Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century by the name of Berossus. So what I want to do for the rest of our time this evening is I want to go through some of these stories and look at them and look at their context and see how they weave together certain themes, certain ideas that are going to help bring extra light to what we know about our biblical story. We want to think again chronologically. Remember, I said all these things exist in our epic mythic past, but our texts do not. Right? Texts exist in time. And so we'll keep coming back to this chart, but we're sort of looking and saying, when are our various flood narratives coming? And we find that our earliest ones are really showing up sometime in the early 2nd millennium, and we're finding examples of them all the way through into the Hellenistic period. Right? But we have a large concentration of texts sort of in this period from our Old Babylonian period into our Middle Babylonian period on the Mesopotamian chronology. All right, so that's sort of our broader context. And again, we'll come back to this with individual examples. But the first one we want to look at is the Sumerian flood account. Right, and so this is going to be one of our earlier ones. The designation can be misleading. The language it's written in is Sumerian. The Sumerians are our sort of earliest civilization occupying this part of the world, and they're living generally in this time period, right? Our 3rd millennium BC. The text itself is from the Babylonian period. They're still using Sumerian as a literary language, but the text actually fits in with other flood traditions. And this text, as you can see, is quite broken. Right? And this is the problem with a lot of ancient texts and tablets is we don't always have the whole thing. So unless we have multiple accounts recording it, this is kind of what we're left with. But this tablet, preserved in the University Museum in Philadelphia, and recently a second portion of a tablet, features an account written in Sumerian, but seeming to have lots of similarities with Babylonian accounts, particularly the account of Atra-Hasis. Elements of this story will sound familiar to us. From what we have from the broken accounts, there is a king. Our king's name is Ziusudra. In Sumerian, this is life of distant days or elongated days is sort of our name. And he's a king who has a special relationship with the gods, who have decided to destroy the earth through a catastrophic deluge, who choose Ziusudra to be a survivor, who builds a boat, survives a deluge, and offers sacrifices to the gods. more or less heavily broken. But this is one of our first accounts with one of our first individuals from an early language tradition. Our largest tradition is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And so here we again want to look at our chronology, and here we have some issues. Gilgamesh is one of our most archaic culture heroes. He's a culture hero from the Sumerians, and our early Gilgamesh epics date to the mid-3rd millennium. We have many stories of Gilgamesh the king, Gilgamesh the hero. Gilgamesh the king saves his city. Gilgamesh the hero fights monsters, goes off to battle, builds giant walls, does various things. Lots of attestations of Gilgamesh. Unfortunately, this Gilgamesh has nothing to do with any floods that we know of, at least not in the text, right? The flood narrative is added on to the Gilgamesh story at some point, we're not sure when, but our earliest account of the flood narrative is going to come in the Old Babylonian period. All right, so that's going to be our first account of a flood narrative attached to these hero traditions of Gilgamesh. But by the standard Babylonian version, this is a copy that George Smith finds the tablet of that comes from the Library of Ashurbanipal, dates again to about the 7th century BC, showing the longevity of this tradition and the longevity of these stories, that they're important for a long period of time. And again, we have fragments of a flood narrative dating back to our Old Babylonian text. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a long story. It's a sad story. It's an epic story about a king named Gilgamesh, who's part of these earlier heroic traditions. He is apparently not the nicest king. The people pray to get rid of him. The gods create a rival for him, a wild man by the name of Enkidu. They fight. They become friends. The people's problems are solved because Gilgamesh's new friend leave the city alone to go wandering off and have adventures together. They kill monsters. They kill the wrong monsters. More monsters are sent to punish them. They kill them too. They make the gods angry. The gods strike Enkidu with a wasting disease, and he shrivels up and dies. Gilgamesh is very sad. Gilgamesh is actually very threatened because Gilgamesh has been thriving on the fact that no one is as large and strong as he is. No one was his rival in physical strength until Enkidu was created as his rival, and his rival has shriveled up into a husk and died. And Gilgamesh says, this is not the way to go. I want to be immortal. I do not want to have this happen to me. And in fact, I know of a relative of mine, a distant relative, who lived once upon a time by the name of Utnapishtim. Translation of this is a little bit odd, but it's a very close to a Akkadian Babylonian rendition of our name Ziusudra. They Utnapishtim is also called the Ruku, which would be the Akkadian word for Sudra in Sumerian. And there's some similarities here, but there's some other etymologies that we won't get into because they're not that important, right? At least for our purposes. But so he goes and hears about this relative that gained immortality, and he goes on a quest to find immortality for himself. So he travels the world through many harsh systems, and he meets his relative Utnapishtim. And he says, I would like to become immortal. How do you do it? And Utnapishtim says, well, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, the gods decided to destroy the world with a giant flood. And this introduces our flood narrative, where Utnapishtim is our flood hero, and the gods again choose him as a special being who is pious in some sort of way to survive the flood. And so our tradition here follows similarly to traditions we are familiar with, right? This widely distributed story tells the tale of a hero who builds a boat, collects some animals, collects their family, is saved from the deluge. It comes back and offers sacrifices to the gods. This story also introduces, though, in Gilgamesh's search for immortality, one of the themes we see in our Mesopotamian literature. And one of the questions we have is, why tell this story? Gilgamesh said, how do I become immortal? And Utnapishtim says, let me tell you a story about a flood, which doesn't sound like an easy connection for us. But the connection comes at the end. And it's a horrible story for Gilgamesh. Right? At the end of the story, we find out that basically the gods had made a decree. Enlil, the king of the great gods, made a decree that no human would survive the flood. And yet here we have one. Utnapishtim has survived the flood. Humans have proven to be valuable. While the earth is flooding and humans are on a boat, the gods have been starved of their sacrifices and their attention, and the gods are very lonely and hungry and angry. They decide that humans are very useful for them. And so they want humans around, but they made a decree that no human would survive. So the descendants of Utnapishtim are humans. But how do we prevent any human from surviving? We grant Utnapishtim basically minor godhood by granting him immortality. Right? So his answer to Gilgamesh is, how did you get out on a linguistic technicality? Is essentially how Utnapishtim gains his immortality, which means Gilgamesh's quest is kind of useless. Unless he somehow is chosen and luckily gets around to this by being the last survivor of a divine decree to kill all humans, he's kind of in trouble. And so this puts him in a little bit of a bind. He says, there must be another way. Utnapishtim says, come on, you can't even stay awake 7 days. How are you going to be immortal? And Gilgamesh says, yes, I can, and then sleeps for 7 days and sort of goes home disappointed. But this is our story, right? The context of our story is in the failure of our hero Gilgamesh to find immortality, right? That was awarded in earlier times. So we have this story, and this story is widely distributed. It starts out in our early periods. Again, our earliest account of that flood narrative shows up in the Old Babylonian period with a tablet fragment from Sippar. And so this is going to include the quest for immortality, right? We have earlier fragments of Gilgamesh stories, but not reference to this particular part of his heroic journey, his heroic quest. But we also find that the Gilgamesh account is not just early, it's everywhere. Right? So we say that this story is about a king of Uruk down in Babylon. But I find copies of the text, right? I found one in the library of Ashurbanipal, a Koyunjik at Nineveh. I have copies from the capital of the Hittite Empire, right? Dating to the 15th or 14th century BC, mid-second millennium, Hattusa, or Bogiskoi would be sort of the modern name for it. I have some coming from the late Bronze Age commercial hub of the Mediterranean in modern-day Turkey, close to the Lebanese border, Ugarit. I have examples from the town of Amar on the Euphrates over here. And I have fragments coming from northern Canaan at the site of Megiddo. Now, this text is also translated into different languages. Right, so I don't just have Akkadian versions of it. When we get to Berossus, we'll talk about some Greek later traditions, but I have languages in Hatti, right, like our Bogiskoi version, written in Hittite and Hurrian, the local languages of Anatolia at the time. And so this demonstrates the spread of Gilgamesh traditions. Now, I want to be clear, most of these tablets are very small and fragmentary and don't necessarily include flood stories. They are stories from the Gilgamesh tradition, from the standard, what we think is that standard Babylonian tale, but we don't have enough of them to say, hey, this is the flood narrative, but it means that people all across this arc are familiar with stories of Gilgamesh, and it's logical to assume they might be familiar with flood stories as well. Again, for our purposes, one of our most important tablets comes from Megiddo, right here, in modern-day Israel, just outside the Jezreel Valley. And so this is an example of Gilgamesh existing in Canaan in the late Bronze Age, right? So around 13th century BC. It does not include a flood account. But again, it does include accounts of Gilgamesh that shows the spread of this story into Canaan from a relatively early period. It also appears to be part of a Western recension of the story, meaning it has some similarities to the Hittite version. Particularly, some of the ways in which they write the name Gilgamesh are similar to ways that they're writing it in the versions coming out of the Hittite Empire in the West. This is going to be important for us later as we think about developments of certain traditions. So that's our probably our widest ranging set of flood stories comes from Gilgamesh. So we have a Sumerian flood story, we have our Gilgamesh flood traditions. The other flood tradition we have is Atra-Hasis. Atra-Hasis, again, we have our most complete version coming from the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, a great-grandson-ish of Hammurabi from the Old Babylonian period. We also have versions from slightly older in the Old Babylonian period, and we have a number of them coming from Iron Age contexts in Assyria. But our most complete one is coming from that early second millennium. And Atra-Hasis is another set of tablets with a very in-depth story. And this story is not just a flood account, it is a creation plus flood account. Story begins, and the Akkadian Babylonian name for the text is actually based on the first line, when the gods instead of man did the work, bore the load, did all the labor, and if you're a god, doing work is really not the most fun thing to do. So we need to find a solution for the fact that we don't like doing work, and the solution for many older gods is let the younger gods do the work. The younger gods aren't too happy with this solution, and they say, what if we kill all of you, and then we don't have to do as much work? Paraphrasing a little bit, but more or less, right? You're getting the picture. And there's conflict among the gods, and they come up with a solution, and their solution is, let's make little worker plebs to do all the work for us, and we'll call them people. So the gods create people to do the labor of the gods, to work for the gods, to feed the gods, to provide for the gods. That's the first half of our story. But then we have a problem. We created people, and the people like to procreate. And then there's a lot of people. And as anyone who may live in the dorms may know, a lot of people can get really noisy. And our gods are kind of like the annoying house mom living in the dorm house saying, quiet down there, and banging a broom on the ceiling saying, hush up, all you little kids. But the people don't. They keep multiplying and they keep getting louder. The gods complain that, in fact, people are too noisy, which is, again, the way they talk about overpopulation. So what do we do if there's too many people and it's too noisy? We flood them out. It actually seems like a fairly extreme solution, but the gods decide that this is going to be their solution. They're going to flood out all of the people. And so they come to flood out all the people, and one of the gods decides this is a bad idea. That god is Enki. Enki is a friend to humans. Enki is a clever god, a crafty god, but Enki really likes people. And Enki thinks this is a bad idea, but Enki has a problem. The gods were forced to swear a pact that they would not talk to the humans about what they were planning to do. And so Enki is not allowed to warn anyone that they are going to save themselves from the flood. But Enki is the crafty god. He's a smart one. And Enki has a friend, and Enki's friend is called Atra-Hasis. In Akkadian, this means exceedingly wise one. He apparently is exceedingly wise. And Enki sits outside of his house on the other side of the wall while Atra-Hasis is taking his rest in the afternoon. And Enki says, hey, Reed House, I have a message that I think you might want to hear. If I were you, Reed House, I would build myself into a boat. Rain is coming. The gods have to decide to destroy the world. And if I were a Reed House, I would build myself into a boat. And the Reed House says nothing because it's a Reed House. But Atra-Hasis, being exceedingly wise, sitting in the Reed House, understands the nature of this message and decides that he will help Reed House build itself into a boat to survive the coming deluge. And so Enki gets around it with another technicality of language, talks to the Reed House, and Atra-Hasis is able to build a boat and then is able to survive the oncoming flood. The gods get upset, but the gods like the fact that they are fed. He offers sacrifices. End of that story, more or less. Atra-Hasis is also a widely spread story. We also have copies of it showing up in Ugarit. This is our only attestation of the flood story found outside Iraq. We have Gilgamesh traditions found outside, but not the flood traditions. So if we're looking at a flood tradition from our general Levantine world, we're again looking to Ugarit, but we have it in the form of Atra-Hasis, again dating to our late Bronze Age-ish, 12th, 13th century, Middle Babylonian period. We have late versions from Nippur, from Assyria, other places showing that the tradition is long-lasting, just as Gilgamesh is a long-lasting tradition. We recently found another version of Atra-Hasis from the Old Babylonian period, and so this made a little bit of news, and so you may have heard this coming out in the last couple of years. But while looking at tablets in the museum, Irving Finkel found a new version of part of the Atra-Hasis narrative, leading to his semi-popular book, The Ark Before Noah, decoding the story of the flood. But in this tablet that we saw there, again pictured here, it's an Old Babylonian tablet from a private collection that preserves part of the Atra-Hasis epic. In particular, it includes details of the construction of the Ark, which is interesting for us if we think about the biblical account with some very detailed instructions of how this is supposed to be built, what we're supposed to do. And so included this is draw out a boat that you will make on a circular plan, let her length and breadth be equal, use of reeds, palm fibers, ropes, bitumen, all in part of making this boat. So thinking about boat making, and Finkel's observation was this ark sounds kind of like a type of boat that we actually know from Mesopotamia. Right? He says that the ark is actually, from this description, sounds like a coracle, a circular type of boat. Here would be sort of a modern example of something similar. Here's an example of one from the palace of Ashur-nasir-pal, an Assyrian king. Here they're using it to cross a river, but right, this rounded type boat. Here's an example from Sennacherib's palace, another Neo-Assyrian relief. Right, these rounded type boats. And Finkel argues that the ark actually, in its origin, is a large round reed boat, maybe with a house sort of on it, which makes sense in the Atra-Hasis account of reed house, make yourself into a boat, right? That looks kind of exactly like what's going on here. And so found these kufa or kufars, which are again modern type of coracle, these round boats, and thinks that this is sort of our inspiration for at least the Atra-Hasis version of the Ark story. So we have accounts from the early Middle Babylonian period. We have accounts from the Sumerians. We have accounts from these Gilgamesh epics. We have accounts showing up in Canaan. We have accounts from Atra-Hasis. But this tradition doesn't die with sort of our Mesopotamian empires. As we get into the Persian or Iranian empire, as we get into the Greek period, we find this story is still being told. And our best account of this comes from the works of Berossus in the Babyloniaca. Berossus is a priest in Babylon and is recording in this Greek world, this Greek context, all the history and traditions he can find about ancient Babylon. Unfortunately, we don't actually have much of Berossus's text actually left. What we know about the Babyloniaca is quoted by other people. Fortunately, it's very popular and it's frequently quoted. So again, he's responsible for recording Babylonian mythology, all things Babylonian. Babylon is so much fun. But again, later authors like Polyhistor are going to be quoting him, which is going to give us evidence of this account. And so apparently it includes 3 parts. History, according to Berossus and Babyloniaca, includes a period before the flood, where there are lots of kings reigning for an ungodly amount, or maybe we would say godly if we look at those numbers, amount of time. Then we have events of the flood, and then kings reigning after the flood. Our king is Xisuthros or Xisuthros of Sippar. Note how this sounds like a Greek version of something like Ziusudra, right? So seems to be part of this tradition coming out of perhaps a Sumerian flood story. But he's tasked by a god who seems to be the equivalent of Ea to build a boat, escape a flood, stow food, drink birds and animals, bury tablets for safekeeping, cultural preservation as part of what needs to happen in the flood. And so bring wives, children, and closest friends. We can have good friends now and escape. Interesting in all these tales is going to be things like who survives, right? And this is going to be a sort of a theological issue. The gods want everyone to die. Who gets to survive? Who doesn't? Who's granted immortality? If we're looking at a question of righteousness or wickedness, like the Bible, then maybe our closest friends might not be the best people, and maybe they don't deserve to come, or maybe we don't have many close friends. Who knows? But we're able to see some differences in who gets to come. After the flood, he sends out birds. One comes back, but its feet are covered in mud, and then finally one doesn't come back, and they exit the boat. He sets up the altar, offers sacrifices, and he's taken to dwell with the gods. So here we have that immortality line, right, that we saw in the Gilgamesh epics with Utnapishtim showing up here. We have some of our other themes that sound familiar to us in many types of ways. But this means that at the 3rd century BC, this is after the time that our biblical text would have been composed, we still have a flood story circulating widely in the broader Mesopotamian, ancient Near Eastern, Mediterranean world. Supposedly the boat comes to rest in the Gordian Mountains in Armenia, and the local population uses it to construct charms. Which is interesting if we start to think of traditions of people going up to high mountains in Armenia and Ararat, claiming to have found the ark because there's wood. There's lots of wood up there. There's lots of shrines up there that a lot of people set up to do things like make charms and commemorate certain types of events. And here we see this in Atra-Hasis. And so we know that there have been attempts to commemorate these types of events for a long period of time. And there's lots of wood and artifacts and other things up there, which are not part of an ancient boat that, if we read the Mesopotamian accounts, was made out of reeds anyway. This brings us to our biblical account of the flood, which I think we generally know, right? That we have the world has gotten wicked. God regrets that he has made people, except for one person who is righteous, and that is Noah. He tells Noah to build himself an ark, to take animals with him, to take his family with him and survive, and a flood will be sent to wipe the wickedness off the earth. It is a recreation type epic where we are starting again after some failures of our sort of first attempt to create a population that is not exceedingly wicked. We do have the question of when these are written, right? When is the biblical flood account written? And I'll come back to this slide, but we seem to think that the biblical text in general, although perhaps based on earlier traditions, is written sometime in this period, right, between the 8th and 5th century BC. But here we encounter our first problem. When I say the biblical flood account, I actually mean flood accounts. There are actually 2 stories of the flood in the Hebrew Bible. You say, wait a minute, we only know of one. It's the one from Genesis 6 to 10. But this is actually 2 separate traditions that have been merged at a later date. One source that scholars would call the J source, often dated sort of this 8th century, although there's some debate on the dating. And one is what the scholars would call our P source, dated to the 5th century. I'll just give you 2 quick examples, there are many more, of why people think there are 2 flood narratives. The first one would be sort of a fairly simple question. How long does the flood last? If I asked you how long the biblical flood lasted, you'd probably say, if you know the story, 40 days and 40 nights. But here I am, I'm reading an account, and I'm reading through Genesis, and I find that the water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the water decreased. What you probably were thinking of is, it came about at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark, which he had made, he sent out a raven, and it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. Wait a minute. Is it 150 days? Is it 40 days? It's 2 stories. It's 2 different stories. And so we're sending a raven, sending out a dove, and they're coming back, sending out of birds. We might remember this. We mentioned this in Atra-Hasis. Keep remembering it. We'll mention it again. We have another type of idea. How many animals does Noah bring on to the ark? Well, again, the traditional answer would be, well, 2. Right, of the animals after their kind, the birds after their kind, of the animals after their kind, of every creeping thing on the ground after its kind, two of every kind will come to keep them alive. This sounds like a story we all know. Wait a minute. You shall take with you every clean animal by sevens, a male and a female. The animals that are not clean, two, a male and a female, also the birds of the sky by sevens. So now I have two of clean animals, two of unclean animals, seven of clean animals is seven of every bird. But I had two of everything before. What's going on here? Two stories merged together. This one we'd associate with P. P is often thought to be a priestly source concerned with priestly things. And so here I need this because I need clean animals, because what am I going to do afterwards? I'm going to offer sacrifice. And if I just have two and I sacrifice them, then that's what happened to the dinosaurs. Also, we may notice some anachronisms here in the sense that which animals are clean? Those would be the ones that God tells Moses at Mount Sinai are clean, which hasn't happened yet, right? And so we have different sources, right, on these types of ideas. And so our need for clean type animals, right, is fitting with some of these other sources. So I actually have two accounts that I'm trying to date, right? And so that's why I'm looking. I'm going to go back here a little bit because I don't know where I put my next one, right? A J account that's supposedly slightly earlier, a P account that's slightly later. Again, could be based on earlier traditions, merged sometime even slightly later into the account that we have today. So the biblical account seems to be written around here. So where's that biblical account coming from? We have lots of options, right? Especially for our earlier ones, we have stories of Gilgamesh floating around Canaan. They could easily have an early flood tradition that comes from, if we believe sort of the Abrahamic narratives, that we've come from Mesopotamia and that our early population that is eventually going to become ancient Israelites comes from Mesopotamia. They might take a flood narrative with them, right? That's perfectly plausible. It could be part of a long oral history. We know that they exist this history exists, something like it in Canaan. And so if we believe that sort of transfer, it could come from here. We also know, if we remember last week in our history, that sometime around here, the Jewish population or Israelite population, Judean population, is exiled into Babylon. And they're taken away and they live in Babylon until the return under the Persians, sometime around when this account is being written. Well, what are they doing in Babylon? What are they doing in Mesopotamia? In some senses, they are joining those populations. And some of the people that have been exiled are the scribes and intelligentsia, who might be encountering certain types of stories, reworking those stories for their own theological purposes, understanding them in the context of their God, of their tradition. And so some people think that our texts are coming from our exposure to Mesopotamian culture from the exile. That's also a possibility. All right, I'm going to flip through this real quick. So we have many shared elements between our biblical account and our Mesopotamian accounts. We have a similar worldview and context, overarching thematic elements, some suspiciously similar details, and some key themes of interest, things like mortality and immortality, relationship of gods and people. We will think about suspicious details. I've already told you about the birds. Right at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window. He set out a raven, flew until the water was dried up. He sent out a dove to see if it abated. Dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, returned to the ark. Water was still on the surface. So it got brought in the ark, waited another 7 days, sent out the dove again, came back with a freshly picked olive leaf, sent out the dove again, did not return. Flood is over, the birds are gone. Hooray. We said Atra-Hasis has a little bit of a similar story, but here's one from Gilgamesh. When the seventh day arrived, our flood in Gilgamesh epic only lasts 7 days. So interesting that we have that 7-day reference coming in Genesis, right? And released a dove. Dove went, it came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned around. Released a swallow. Swallow went, it came back, for no perching place was visible, and it turned around. I put out and released a raven. The raven went, saw the waters receding, it ate, preened, lifted its tail, and did not turn around. It left, right? And so here again, this idea of birds being used to indicate that the flood is over, and even some of the same birds. Not just that we're using birds for this, the dove and the raven, right, as specific words being used. Here we have a swallow, we have multiple doves in the biblical account, but some key similarities, right, in what's going on that are suspiciously similar, right? In terms of a broader cultural context is one thing, but these are some details that show some perhaps closer relationships between these types of texts. We also have some similarities in the aftermath. Where does the ark land? Hebrew Bible says the mountains of Ararat, which people have looked for various places, looking at places like Mount Ararat, which is the highest mountain there. Hey, everything was flooded. We're going to hit the highest one first. That's how things work, right? Other ones like Mount Kuridag down here. In the Gilgamesh epic, we land on Mount Nimush, which is over here. But this again may be telling us more about traditions. Where are the mountains of Ararat? They're in Turkey. Where do we have other Gilgamesh accounts? The Hittites, right? What does our copy, our fragment at Megiddo uses the same language to interpret the Gilgamesh name as the Hittites. So maybe this would be an account that this is an older account. The Hittites are long gone by the time of the exile, that there's some earlier traditions floating around here. Then again, Berossus is one of our latest traditions, and Berossus has it coming down in Armenia, which is also going to be kind of up in our same type of area. So we could also argue that the Armenia tradition is a late tradition that's being seen in Berossus, and Ararat's related to these later traditions. I can argue it either way. But there's some interesting similarities there. We also have some similarities in what we do, right? In the Atra-Hasis epic, we come back, we offer to the gods. Gods smell the fragrance and gather like flies over the offering. Not the most positive portrayal of our deities, but you know what? They decided to kill us, and now they're hungry, and so they deserve it. In fact, this sounds like the Gilgamesh epic. The gods smelt the fragrance, the gods smelt the pleasant fragrance, the gods like flies gathered over the sacrifice. In both these, the gods have realized that when the flood happens and people are mostly dead or holed up on a boat, that they get really, really hungry. And sacrifices are the food of the gods, and the gods are miserable and afraid and starving in their own little spot in the heavens until people come back, at which point they have a problem. We were supposed to kill everybody, but we really like you, so we'll deify some people, but we're all good, right? This is how we're dealing with the problem, and we're not going to kill you again because we realize that hunger is not a good look for us. The biblical account is somewhat different, but somewhat similar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma. The Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. We have a sacrifice. God says it smells yummy. We don't have the same ran over to it like flies. We have different language that very specifically is avoiding the Mesopotamian language of gods have need, God needs our food. Right? Our God of the Hebrew Bible doesn't need food, but he does sure like the smell of it, and he smells it and decides not to destroy people again, which means the outcome's very similar. Right? So we have some very similar structures. We have some very key changes, right? Some nuanced sort of theological changes going on, particularly with how people relate to the gods, how the gods, this sort of symbiotic relationship, right, between gods and people that is very common in the Mesopotamian world, but which the biblical accounts largely reject in the sense that does God need people? And we can see that in some of these accounts that, again, are similar, but also different. We see differences in the reason for the flood, right? Atra-Hasis, we said people are noisy. Gilgamesh, we didn't need a reason. We suspect, actually, given other things that's similar to the Atra-Hasis one, in the Bible, people are wicked. So again, a moral undertone to this that we don't see in other things, in the sense that God needs a good reason to cause destruction. Our Mesopotamian gods don't need good reasons to do bad things. They're gods, right? So do we need to have a moral excuse, a moral reason for our actions? And the authors of our Hebrew Bible are saying yes. We cannot cause the destruction of so many people without a good reason, where our Mesopotamian gods can, we did not think this out and we got annoyed by the noise and we just decided to kill them all. And if they're not trying to portray them as moral actors, this is not a problem. So again, we see some nuanced differences in why this is happening that are rooted in some of the theology of the creators of the Hebrew Bible. Our duration is slightly different. Who is saved? We have some slightly different configurations, but generally the flood hero, family, animals. Sometimes in one case, we're loading all the gold and silver onto the ark because clearly with all the people dead, that's going to do us a lot of good. So much stuff to buy later. But so some differences, but some similarities in our structures and themes. But we also see that these stories fit into a biblical construction that we might call a mythic construction of etiology, explaining why things are the way they are. And in Mesopotamia, these have a very strong etiology for overpopulation. Why does the flood happen? Overpopulation, right? Because of noise. So what happens at the end of the flood? The best example of this comes from a broken version of Atra-Hasis, but we can read between the lines and figure it out. They spoke to the womb goddess Nintu. You are the womb goddess who decrees the destinies. Let a third of them, people, be something, a third of them be something else. We don't know, it's broken. In addition, let a third of the people among the people, the women who give birth, yet does not birth successfully. It's an explanation for stillbirths, for miscarriage. Let there be the Peshitu demon among the people to snatch the baby from its mother's lap. Infant mortality. Establish Ugbabtu, Entu, and Agishtu women. They shall be taboo and thus control childbirth. Priestesses who are not allowed to marry. So we've decided to control population in other ways. And the way that these etiologies work is, instead of destroying everybody, bad things are going to happen. It's an explanation for why in this world do I have things like miscarriage and stillbirth? Why do I have infant mortality? Things that we think are bad for good reason, right? That these wouldn't be desirable. Why are they happening? The gods have decreed them as part of the cost of avoiding this again and keeping the noise down. Why do we have institutions that forbid certain types of priestesses from marrying? It has been decreed by the gods from mythological time. And we may sit here and say, well, this sounds like something unique to the Mesopotamian account. We also have something similar in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a Sumerian writing of Gilgamesh. That's a change in the letters that we're not going to worry about. But this is also dealing with questions of mortality and immortality. In those days, in those distant days, in those nights, in those distant nights, in those years, in those distant years, after the assembly made the flood sweep over, destroy the seed of mankind among us, I was the only one who was for life, so he remained alive, Ziu Sudra, although human being, remained alive. So the name here is our Sumerian flood hero showing up in this, again, Sumerian account of the death of our hero. You made me swear by heaven and by earth that no human will be allowed to live forever anymore. Right, that there's a time when humans could be immortal, that we could have these heroes. Right now, as we look at Gilgamesh, could he escape because of his mother? The gods are basically debating whether or not to give Gilgamesh immortality in this particular poem, and they are going to deny it to him. Right, so these traditions of Gilgamesh's search for immortality seem to be rooted in other places. One of those places is part of the Sumerian epic, but their understanding is there was a point in time when it was possible for us to grant immortality to humans, and this is not that time anymore. That ended with the flood. We have this passage in Genesis, though, preceding the flood narrative in Genesis 6, chapter 3. People and their wickedness are spreading. A lot of the beginning of Genesis 6 I'm not going to get into because I don't have any answers for what's going on there. But basically, the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. A limitation put on to the lifespan of humans. This seems out of place in our general account of Genesis. How does this fit in with our broader narrative? But this fits very much in place with etiologies of mortality and lifespan and limiting human populations. Right? That there might be an undertone of some of these themes that stay in the biblical tradition in some of these types of stories. We have another question. Is there an historical flood? We have these accounts in the Hebrew Bible. We have these accounts from the Sumerians. We have these accounts in Atra-Hasis and Gilgamesh. Why do we have all of these accounts? Obviously, one of the first thoughts when George Smith reads the flood tablet is, here we have someone else's account of this biblical event that happened sometime in history. Now we may hear accounts of our giant global flood. I first want to point out that the Bible says nothing about this. The biblical authors have no concept of globality. They use the term, right? The flood comes al haaretz, on the land. Land is not a particularly specific term that can be quite large or quite restricted. And so when all the land and all life on the land is wiped out, that you're not exactly limiting yourself there. We have lots of evidence of flooding events in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. It's known we have destructions of floods. We have textual accounts of this. We have archaeological accounts of this. Floods happen. But I have no proven layer in which all the cities of the Mesopotamian floodplain are wiped out at the same time at once by a flood. This could be hard to find depending on the date of it, depending on the time, but a singular destructive flood event has not been something that anyone has been able to identify archaeologically. Certain layers, yes, flood damage, destruction. Layers at the same time from the same event, not so much. Right, and so in this sense, the tale seems to be taking a disaster that we know well, a flood, and mythicizing it. Right, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But there have been some attempts to try and put this in a historical event. The most recent one is going to be, I'll come back to that in a minute, the Black Sea hypothesis. This hypothesis basically presumes that there's a period of time around 10,000 years ago, right? So we have our Mediterranean going into the Black Sea through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. That there is a rapid sea rise that basically goes over these land bridges and massively floods the Black Sea basin. And that happens very, very quickly. And that, in fact, there are lots of people, this is our early Stone Age, that are living next to the water. And all of these people are suddenly killed or displaced. And that these people eventually migrate into the Mesopotamian floodplain and remember a time when they lived back up in this area somewhere, and there was a flood and many people died and were destroyed. Right, and so that theory has been sort of presented as part of the geological creation of the saltwater Black Sea that is previously a freshwater lake until this overflows, again, sometime around 9 to 10,000 years ago. The Black Sea hypothesis is not well received anymore, largely because all the accounts that the geologists and oceanographers can figure out is the sea level doesn't rise quick enough. That people would have plenty of time to relocate as the sea levels rose, and it's not a sudden event going on. The connection to the Mesopotamian floodplain is all conjectural anyway, and so there have been a lot of criticism, I think just criticism of this reconstruction, but it's one that you'll run into. Oops, I want to jump back to this for a second here. Remember I said that the flood doesn't have to be global if we're thinking about localized? If it is global, this is the world according to Babylon. We have no reason to think that the world according to Babylon is much different from the world according to ancient Israelites. And this is the Babylonian map of the world. It's a very famous tablet. And it shows the center of the world is Babylon. We have major canals. We have fringe areas of foreign places, and we are surrounded by mountains and islands. Right? Mountains and islands surrounding us. And so this idea of anything that's our conception of globe or round or anything else, we have water out here, water fills the basin, whole world is flooded. Not a very big scale of things, right? And so if we think about this conception, think about what we mean by all the land being flooded, we're looking at a couple of cities around the canals and the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, right? According to our Babylonian maps and conceptions of the world. So our other option is that the flood is a cultural event, right? It's a cultural horizon that basically is serving as a dividing point in history between the mythic past and the non-mythic present. We have stories of things that happened in the past, heroes and monsters and various sages, and we don't have those anymore. What happened? Big flood. right? All the trappings of civilization. How did we get these? The gods walked among us. What changed? Big flood. It's a horizon. It's a marker of before and after. In fact, we see quite a bit of evidence for that. The Sumerian king list is a document that we have that is tracing the history of kingship from sort of the beginning of time up until later periods in history. It's a text that seems to get added onto over time. Right, so in one of our summary statements, in 5 cities, 8 kings that ruled for 241,200 years. Then the flood, the Amaru, you can see the signs for it down here, swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, and the kingship was in Kish. Supposedly a justification for the kingship of the later Sargonic Akkadian rulers, going back to prehistory. It is very much a literary text more than a historical list. It assumes that kingship goes from one city to another in succession, when we know there are a lot of independent city-states vying for control at the same time. Right? It's justifying the sort of imperial one head king system that exists in the Sargonic period. Later, Ashurbanipal, the owner of our famous library in the 7th century, he claims, as part of his many boastings about how cool he is, that he reads cunningly written text in Sumerian, dark Akkadian, the interpretation of which is difficult. I've examined stone inscriptions from before the flood, which are sealed, stopped up, mixed up. Right, so he recognizes the flood as an event where different mythic past happened before that, and he's cool because he can read those things. Which he actually probably can. Ashurbanipal is never supposed to be king. He's trained as sort of a scribe. And so apparently probably can read some of these things. But this is his claim, right? So recognizing this cultural difference. And so here we have a cultural boundary. Here again, we can turn to another tradition here, our Sumerian kingship, right? I said this is our list of kings in Babylon. Our earliest version dates to the Ur III period, late Sumerian, around 2200 BC. Most copies are Old Babylonian, but it details the kings who reigned before the deluge, before the flood. And we saw, in fact, in Berossus, the 3 parts, the kings before the flood, reigning for 482,000 years. This is not present in every edition, but we have this addition of a flood tradition in the Babylonian period. After kingship descended from Eridu, right, ruled for 28,800 years. Oh, dear Lord. Right, kingship went to Babdabira, were reigning for ridiculous long time. Right here are 5 kings, ridiculous amounts of time. Before the flood, kings reigned for a long time. Not the only place where we have a tradition of before the flood, people being around for a long time. If I look in the genealogies from Adam to Noah in Genesis 5, I have 2 of them here. Adam living to 930, Seth 912. Our most famous example is Methuselah 969. We have what seem to be ridiculously long ages from a period before the flood. Right? So here's another tradition that we have where the Sumerian king list in our pre-flood, different worlds, different rules, changing at the flood, seems also to be reflected in some of the ages in the Bible. I have one more bit for you for the end of the night, because at the end of the flood, we end up somewhere else on the Mesopotamian floodplain. We end up on the plain of Shinar. Shinar is our biblical term for the plain of Babylon. And here, our people have gotten off the flood. We've spread out. We've repopulated. And we are going to build a city and a tower. Tower of Babel. False etymology for Babylon. Babel is our Hebrew word, obviously, for Babylon. And God confuses Levavel, the language of the people, right? And so it's a false etymology there. But we're building a tower made out of fired bricks that, again, we can see are Flemish painting, but this is probably a Babylonian temple tower. A ziggurat is what we call them. They are shrines. The gods live up here. We don't have mountains on the floodplain. Gods live on top of mountains, so we're going to build them one. Right, so our Genesis 11 account. Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. Very interesting. Mesopotamian bricks are burned. Bricks in Israel are not. They're sun-dried. Right, so a tradition that seems to be Mesopotamian sort of construction. They use tar for mortar. Also not a local tradition in Canaan or ancient Israel. They said, come, let's build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach the heaven. I have the Hebrew down here. Ir umigdal v'rosho b'shamayim. A tower with its head in the heavens. Let's make ourselves a name, otherwise we'll be scattered abroad the face of the whole earth, which is obviously what happens. We can think about names. Our ancient temples all have names, and I have names here, some of our ziggurats from the Mesopotamian world. The Etamananki, the house. A means house, but it also means palace or temple, right? Well, Egal, the big house would be palace, but temple, right? So in this case, the temple, the platform between heaven and earth. The Eandasa'a, the house that rivals the heavens. The Baramak, the exalted dais. The Eduranki, the temple, the bond between heaven and earth. The Ekun Ankuga, the house, the holy stairway of heaven, which if you want to preview for coming attractions potentially, Jacob's ladder in his dream where he sees a stairway connecting earth and heaven as a bond between heaven and earth and people ascending and descending. Sounds also very much like one of these, just for random, throw it out there. We have a temple in Babylon that is not a ziggurat, it's a temple of the Marduk called the Esagil, the house with its head raised up. Sounds kind of like house with its head in the clouds, right? So even the thing that they're saying, let us build, sounds like they're building one of these types of structures. So again, looking at Babylonia, Mesopotamia as a context for understanding these stories, the wording, what's going on here, and clearly building an unauthorized temple in not a right place in order to tie God to a certain location is the type of thing the biblical authors would frown upon very much. Particularly our authors who like one place of worship in Jerusalem, this would seem very inappropriate, right? And certainly if we're in a Babylonian context, a adopting of other Babylonian religious customs, right? So all this, again, just showing us some of the context, the literary, cultural context that the biblical traditions are coming up in, that are at the same time, they are part of these traditions, they are reacting with them and also against them, right? We have some theological differences, we have adopting them, the biblical authors are part of this world and this culture, and in ways that they don't know and just sort of assume, and ways that they want to react against to be different from everybody else. That's all we have for Noah. We will come back in 2 weeks, and we will also look at a different period in our early history and try and trace this movement from Mesopotamia into Canaan by seeing what we can find out about the life and context and archaeology of the world of Abraham. Thank you all very much.